We do not begin the story of America in 1776 with founding fathers declaring liberty. We begin in 1619. That is the year, long before the nation was born, that the first ship carrying enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. This was not the start of prejudice, but it was the start of systemic, legally codified oppression that would define the continent's future. The true founding of the United States was built not on a philosophy of equality, but on a financial formula: human life calculated as commodity. This was the system of chattel slavery, where a black person was not merely enslaved, but was movable property, an asset that could be bought, sold, mortgaged, or used as collateral in a bank loan. This was a fundamental, cynical legal act that stripped millions of people of the right to their own body, their name, their family, and their future. The state did not just permit slavery, it actively codified it into law. State and federal statutes prohibited enslaved people from learning to read or write, because literacy could breed thoughts of resistance. Law annulled marriages between the enslaved to facilitate their sale and the separation of families. Violence, torture, and rape were not random acts of cruelty. They were economic tools of coercion designed to ensure maximum productivity and the total suppression of will. This was not a moral lapse, it was a legal and financial blueprint. Slavery was never just a Southern problem. It was the engine of the entire American and global economy. The cotton grown under the brutal sun was white gold that funded the industrial revolutions in New York and Europe. Northern banks provided the credit secured by human lives. Northern insurance companies underwrote the loss of enslaved people. The wealth accumulated on Wall Street is directly rooted in stolen labor. The entire nation was, therefore, complicit in this largest capital theft in world history. Yet, even beneath the unbearable weight of the chains, a miracle of cultural survival and resistance took root. Through pain and fear, Africans and their descendants created unique, deeply coded forms of defiance. Spirituals were not merely songs. They were encrypted maps in messages of freedom. The Underground Railroad was not simply a trail. It was a network of incredible courage. This legacy includes armed revolts, acts of daily sabotage, and the quiet, persistent refusal to be broken. This was the battle to retain the soul. By 1860, the conflict was unavoidable. The Civil War was, at its core, a financial war over the right to own human capital. Though Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union victory in 1865 brought legal freedom, the mental and economic chains remained. 4 million people were suddenly declared free, but were given no land, no capital, and no legal protection. The system had to change, but its underlying objective, oppression, would quickly find new, more insidious ways to survive. 1865. 4 million people, declared free, stood on the ashes of the Confederacy. The period known as Reconstruction began with a radical, fleeting promise: full citizenship and integration. For a few years, black men voted, served as elected officials, and created schools and churches. This was the nation's first genuine, albeit fragile, experiment in multiracial democracy. But the white elite of the South, financially ruined by the loss of their human capital, could not allow this freedom to take root. The promise was betrayed. Reconstruction was brutally crushed by a dual assault of terror and legislation. First came the terror, the birth of the Ku Klux Klan and other paramilitary groups that functioned as the unofficial, violent enforcement arm of white supremacy. Their goal was not mere racial hatred, it was political and economic repression, intimidating black voters, driving elected officials from office, and ensuring that newly freed people remained tied to the land. This was an act of domestic warfare against democracy itself. Second came the system. Southern states quickly enacted the Black Codes and then the sweeping Jim Crow laws. If chattel slavery was direct legal ownership, Jim Crow was a sophisticated, legally codified system of apartheid. It permeated every aspect of life: separate schools, separate hospitals, separate train cars, and economic policies designed to ensure dependency. The goal was to render the black citizen permanently second class and powerless, regardless of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The death knell for true equality was sounded in 1896 by the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. The court upheld the doctrine of separate but equal, a phrase that instantly became the cruelest lie in American history. Separation was absolute and enforced by violence. Equality was a devastating fiction. This ruling provided federal, constitutional authority for segregation, giving the white South a license to build an entire society based on oppression that would endure for 60 more years. Parallel to this legal dismantling, a new form of economic servitude flourished: sharecropping and convict leasing. Sharecropping trapped black farmers in perpetual, inescapable debt to white landowners. Even more barbaric was the system of convict leasing. States arrested black men on minor or fabricated charges, like vagrancy, and then literally leased their labor to private companies, mines, lumber yards, and plantations. This was the state replacing the individual slave owner, selling the labor of its own citizens for profit. It was slavery legally disguised as penal reform. By the turn of the 20th century, just decades after the promise of freedom, the black American citizen lived under a regime that was, in terms of economic power and personal dignity, barely distinguishable from slavery. This betrayal created the crucible that would fuel the next great act of defiance: a mass exodus from the South. The first decades of the 20th century were defined by a single, seismic act of resistance: the Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million black Americans, voting with their feet, fled the brutal, institutionalized terror of Jim Crow in the South. They were not seeking a vacation. They were escaping a system of economic peonage, where sharecropping kept them perpetually indebted, and a culture of casual violence and public lynching that made life cheap. This mass movement was the first great step toward demanding true citizenship. The promise of the North and West was supposed to be freedom, but what migrants found was a cruel substitution: economic apartheid. They traded the legal chains of de jure segregation for the invisible, structural chains of de facto segregation. Northern cities used sophisticated financial weapons to maintain the racial hierarchy. Redlining, a practice we've detailed before, was fully implemented in this era, using federal maps to starve black neighborhoods of capital, denying mortgages, and forcing migrants into overcrowded, high-rent tenements. This systemic housing exclusion ensured that generational wealth could never be built, regardless of how hard one worked in the factories of Detroit, Chicago, or Harlem. Yet, out of this immense pressure and confinement, a powerful cultural phenomenon exploded: the Harlem Renaissance. This was not merely an artistic movement, it was a declaration of intellectual independence and human worth. Thinkers, writers, and artists like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and W.E.B. Du Bois refused the narrative of inferiority imposed by Jim Crow. They articulated a powerful, complex black identity using poetry, jazz, and literature to reclaim dignity and challenge the nation's racist conscience. This cultural awakening provided the philosophical and moral ammunition for the battles that lay ahead. Crucially, This era witnessed the aggressive building of independent black institutions. When the broader society shut them out, black Americans built their own parallel structures. Historically, black colleges and universities, HBCUs, were not just schools. They became training grounds for the legal minds, strategists, and leaders who would eventually dismantle segregation. Organizations like the NEACP began meticulously building legal cases, gathering evidence of educational and housing inequality, preparing for a frontal assault on the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. By the 1940s and early 1950s, the pieces were in place. The cultural power of the Renaissance had shattered the myth of black intellectual inferiority. The economic power of the migration had concentrated millions into crucial northern voting blocs, and the legal infrastructure was ready to strike. The stage was set for the Supreme Court to hear the case that would fundamentally challenge American law and morality. Brown versus Board of Education. The quiet, organized defiance of this generation was about to become the roar of a movement. The dam broke in 1954 with the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, which finally declared that separate but equal was inherently unconstitutional. This ruling was the legal trigger, but the true force was the people. The period from 1955 to 1970 marked the epic clash between the moral power of nonviolent resistance and the brutal, entrenched force of state-sponsored racism. The fight was no longer hidden. It was played out on the nation's television screens, forcing white America to confront the brutality of the system it had long ignored. The movement was organized, disciplined, and relentless. It began with quiet, dignified defiance, such as the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks and led by the emerging figure of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It escalated to direct confrontation with the sit-in movement, where students demanded service at segregated lunch counters, meeting hate with calm dignity. The Freedom Rides forced the federal government to intervene, as young activists risked their lives to challenge segregation on interstate transportation, facing firebombs and savage beatings. But the movement had multiple necessary facets. While Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence sought to hold America accountable to its own founding documents, other leaders articulated a growing impatience and a demand for self-determination. Malcolm X offered a powerful, uncompromising critique of white supremacy, urging black Americans to control their own destiny by any means necessary. His message resonated deeply in the northern ghettos, where de facto segregation and police brutality were daily realities. Later, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense emerged, merging self-defense with revolutionary social programs, such as free breakfast for children and community health clinics, challenging state authority directly. The pressure from these efforts, King's moral appeal, Malcolm's radical critique, and the Panthers' direct action, finally forced legislative change. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations and employment. It was followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dismantled the insidious legal barriers, literacy tests, poll taxes, that had blocked black political power for a century. These two acts were the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. However, the violence did not end. The nation watched as leaders were assassinated, Malcolm X in 1965 and Dr. King in 1968, and major cities erupted in fury. The victories achieved through law were quickly met with a political backlash and a strategic counter-movement. The nation had changed the laws, but it had not changed the fundamental structures of power, or resolved the deep economic inequalities that lay at the root of the movement's demands. The legislative chains were broken, but the economic and systemic ones were already being forged anew. The legislative victories of the civil rights movement were monumental, but the response was immediate and strategic. The period from 1970 to 2000 was defined by a political and institutional counterattack designed to roll back progress and reestablish control through non-racialized language. The explicit chains of Jim Crow were replaced by the insidious, colorblind policies of mass incarceration, creating the new American apartheid. This strategic pivot was epitomized by the declaration of the War on Drugs. Though framed as a necessary measure to combat crime, the policy was a deliberate instrument of social control. As a former Nixon administration official later admitted, the goal was to associate black people and the anti-war movement with drugs, allowing the government to aggressively disrupt and criminalize those communities. The strategy was perfected during the Reagan years. Increased policing, mandatory minimum sentences, and laws that strategically targeted inner-city populations ravaged by deindustrialization and economic abandonment. The most potent weapon in this new war was the sentencing disparity. Federal laws enacted mandatory minimums for crack cocaine, a cheaper form primarily used in poor, urban, and black communities that were up to 100 times harsher than penalties for powder cocaine, which was favored by wealthier, predominantly white users. This legislative disparity was not a mistake. It was the engine of mass incarceration. Judges lost discretion, and minor drug offenses led to decades-long prison terms. The black population, already destabilized by the economic withdrawal of factories and jobs, was swept into the penal system. The result was a demographic catastrophe. Between 1980 and 2000, the United States prison population skyrocketed from roughly 500,000 to over 2 million. This explosion created a vast, state-funded system of social control, effectively replacing Jim Crow with a legal apparatus designed to sideline and neutralize millions of black men and women. For many, the prison cell became the new plantation, a place of forced removal from society and economic opportunity. The pervasive police brutality that had existed for decades finally erupted into the national consciousness in 1991 with the beating of Rodney King by LAPD officers, captured on videotape. The subsequent acquittal of those officers in 1992 triggered the Los Angeles uprising, a devastating explosion of anger and despair that exposed the deep fracture lines in American society. This event served as a visceral symbol. Even with the Civil Rights Act on the books, state power, specifically police impunity, remained fundamentally unchecked. Amidst this siege of legislative and physical violence, a powerful cultural response emerged. Hip-hop became the unfiltered, journalistic voice of the inner city. It documented the reality of police harassment, criticized the systemic poverty, and challenged the false narrative of law and order. It was a critical cultural survival mechanism and a new form of resistance, chronicling the era of new chains. The 21st century began with what many hoped was the symbolic zenith of racial progress, the election of Barack Obama in 2008. His presidency was proof of the monumental efforts of the civil rights generation, yet it simultaneously exposed the deep national fallacy that America had become post-racial. While the White House held a black family, the structural violence, the new chains of mass incarceration and economic exclusion remained intact. This era would be defined by the collision between symbolic success and the shattering reality of systemic failure. The defining characteristic of this period is the advent of the smartphone and the visible fault lines of policing. No longer were acts of state violence hidden. They were captured, documented, and broadcast globally in real time. The acquittal of George Zimmerman in the 2013 killing of Trayvon Martin, followed by the police killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson and Eric Garner in New York, proved that the legal apparatus protecting state agents remained virtually untouched since the days of Jim Crow. This exposure led to the organic, decentralized birth of the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movement. BLM was not simply a reform movement, it was a demand for a moral reckoning and complete systemic transformation. It challenged the core institutions, policing, housing, education, and health, that perpetuate racial hierarchy. The movement accelerated into a global phenomenon in 2020 after the horrific 9-minute murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis. An act so brazenly captured on video that it ignited the largest civil rights demonstrations in history, extending far beyond American borders. This mass mobilization was met, predictably, with a forceful backlash. This political counter-movement attempts to deny the very existence of structural racism. Efforts focused on suppressing the right to vote, with states enacting restrictive laws that disproportionately affect black voters, a direct echo of the Jim Crow poll taxes and literacy tests dismantled 60 years ago. Furthermore, there has been a powerful attempt to erase history through campaigns against critical race theory, CRT, and the restriction of teaching uncomfortable truths about American slavery and systemic oppression. Today, the struggle continues on multiple fronts: in the streets, in the courts, and in the education system. The economic gap created by centuries of theft, from slavery to redlining, remains a profound obstacle to true equity. The health gap, tragically highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic, shows that systemic disparities translate directly into life and death outcomes. The fight for black democracy is, therefore, the fight for the soul of the nation, a continuous, necessary struggle to force America to finally live up to the promise of its founding ideals. The chains may look different now, but the quest for true, substantive freedom is far from over.